All right, so what we're going to do now is take a look at what happens if you're a prey organism that isn't camouflaged or isn't camouflaged well enough to avoid detection by a predator species. So the next best bet you want to go with if you're detected by a predator is to have some way to defend yourself. So this could be anything from armor to chemical defenses to physical spiny kinds of defenses to claws or fangs or behaviors that help convince a predator that maybe that predator shouldn't attack you. Right? So we can look at again. There's trade-offs here, right? If you have relatively well-developed armor, then chances are you're not going to be the fastest organism. On the other hand, if you're relatively quick and agile or nimble, chances are you're going to be fairly susceptible to damage should you actually get attacked and hit by a predator species. So there's always trade-offs here, right? There's always you do one thing really well, that's going to compromise some other aspect of your biology. There's always this idea of trade-offs in evolution. Another way to go in terms of defensive strategies and ways to prevent yourself from being attacked is to take on what's called aposematic coloration. And aposematic coloration, what this means is it's warning coloration, basically. It's some way to advertise to a predator that you are harmful, that you have some way to defend yourself, and so therefore you should not be attacked. This is like the anti-camouflage. This is advertising your presence and trying to be upfront and say, look, I'm not hiding myself. I don't have to, because if you attack me, you're not going to like the outcome. Right? So we can hear aposematic coloration in things like pine snakes and rat snakes that have the ability to rattle their tail in the leaves or in the pine needles. And what that will do is it will sound a lot like, and very convincingly like, a rattlesnake. And so that might be something to help prevent you from attacking that snake if you are a predator. If all of a sudden you hear a rattling sound, it might be something more dangerous than what you imagine, so you might want to stay away from it. So we'll see some examples of aposematic coloration. We see it in bees and wasps, things that have bright red or yellow bands alternating with black or sometimes white. Monarch butterflies, which are black and orange, also aposematic coloration, advertising their presence, advertising their defenses to their respective predators to help avoid them being attacked. Now, one question that comes up here, and that has come up in the past with evolutionary biology, is does a predator actually have to experience the bad part of the coloration in order to learn from it? Or is there an instinctive avoidance of that coloration that the predator comes pre-equipped with, so it never has to attack one in order to learn that it's kind of a bad coloration that you want to stay away from? And it turns out it's really both. Right? There seems to be an inherent avoidance behavior of things like monarch butterflies by birds. Most birds will never go near a monarch butterfly with the intent of capturing it or eating it, and they never have to experience the downside. They never have to actually attack one and be harmed in some way to learn that. They just seem to kind of avoid it inherently. Genetically, they have a predisposed instinctive avoidance of things that look like monarch butterflies. On the other hand, there can be cases where maybe a particular individual didn't quite get that genetic message. They might see that monarch butterfly flying by, and they might say, hey, look, lunch. And so they go and attack it. They have a fairly nasty experience that we'll see here in a second on the slide. And from that point on, you could not convince that bird to attack another monarch butterfly ever throughout its entire life. So even though it is predominantly an instinctive behavior, there is also learning that goes along with this to help those that maybe didn't quite get the message genetically learn to stay away from those particular individuals. And then once you have aposematic coloration, that will then set the stage for mimicry, which is where you have harmless organisms that look a lot like harmful organisms and as such achieve a benefit by looking like those harmful organisms. So these are all examples of aposematic coloration. We have in the upper left here a coral snake, which is quite poisonous, has a fairly potent neurotoxin. There are also lots of things that mimic coral snakes. We have a tiger salamander down here, which is also poisonous. Definitely not trying to camouflage itself down here at all. It's definitely just sort of out there and advertising its presence to the entire world. And chances are, despite the fact this thing is big and plump and slow moving and probably chock full of calories and protein, you will not find many things in nature that will actually attack a tiger salamander because they are so poisonous. And the two right-hand pictures are poison dart frogs. Again, all different variations of these things, bright blue and purple and yellow and green and red, and certainly not camouflaged in any way, but they're advertising their toxicity to their potential predators. As far as different kinds of mimicry, there are two main types. There is one called Batesian mimicry, which is like your classical mimicry. You have a harmless individual, what we call a mimic, that tries to look like a harmful, what we call a model. So the mimic looks like a model. The mimic is harmless. The model is harmful in this case. And so in this case, we have predators who have a bad experience with a model. They then generalize that to anything else that look like that model, and from that point on, they're going to stay away from it. Anything that looks like or sounds like the thing they had the bad experience with, they're going to stay away from it forever. So there's a learning experience. One of the things here that's really important with Batesian mimicry is that the models always have to be more abundant than the mimics. If they're 50-50 mimic and model, then every other time a predator attacks one, it's going to have a good meal. And so even though the other times it has a bad experience, it might not be a strong enough learning experience for them to begin to make that generalization from appearance to, yeah, I should stay away from this. So really with Batesian mimicry, the models have to be, like 90-95% of the population, and the mimics can be the remainder. But if they get too much more abundant than that, then the predators have a hard time generalizing from their experiences. The other type of mimicry that we'll talk about is Mullerian mimicry. And Mullerian mimicry is where you have two harmful or noxious, harmful species that look like each other. So when you look at anything in the realm of bees or wasps or hornets or those kinds of things, they all kind of sort of have the same appearance, black and red and yellow or white bands that advertise to any sort of potential harmful organism that they could actually defend themselves. There's a couple of ways we think this might have happened. It could be a matter of convergent evolution. So it could be that even though these different species of wasps and bees and hornets and so forth evolved independently, maybe the coloration they have just happens to be a really good way to convey to predators that they should be avoided. And so then maybe it's not surprising that multiple organisms have come up with the same approach to their coloration. Or it could be a matter of actual mimicry and sympatric mimicry, where if all these different species, if 5 different species have kind of the same coloration, then they all kind of sort of protect each other. Because if a predator attacks one of the 5 species and has a bad experience, that predator then generalizes to the other 4 species, and they all achieve protection from that. So it's also likely a matter of a real mimicry situation where the different color patterns are reinforcing each other because they all have the similar coloration, because they can all defend themselves. When one gets attacked, it benefits the entire group. Right, so on the left over here, we have a blue jay faced with a decision. It doesn't know it, and I don't expect you to know it, but the picture on the top here is of a viceroy butterfly, which is perfectly harmless, perfectly palatable. You could consume this if you're a bird and get a pretty good chunk of calories out of it. This one, on the other hand, is a monarch butterfly, which is a completely different story. These guys are very, very toxic. They spend their lives feeding on milkweed plants, which contain all kinds of really nasty chemicals and cardiac glycosides and things like that. So if you consume one of these, if you're a blue jay or if you're a person for that matter, you're gonna get a sick tummy as a result. Much more severe if you're a blue jay because of the smaller body mass. So this over here on the left is Batesian mimicry. On the right, we have Mullerian mimicry with 3 different species of wasps that all have kind of the same appearance, same coloration, and as a result, they sort of get this group protection from predators. This is a blue jay that goes, if it were to go ahead and try to consume the monarch butterfly, step A is to consume the butterfly. Step B is to spend the next 4 to 5 hours throwing up. And that's actually what happens here. This bird spends several hours not only throwing up the butterfly, but dry heaving as a result. And there's nothing you could do beyond that point to ever convince this bird to try another monarch butterfly. They learn their lesson relatively quickly that these butterflies are something which they should stay away from. This is actually a fairly primitive kind of psychological concept called taste aversion, where if you consume something that makes you sick, like physically sick, like you throw up sick, there's a built-in mechanism to help you avoid that substance again in the future. You've all had experiences where you've had a meal, you've had maybe a favorite food, and for whatever reason you've gotten really sick afterwards. Maybe it was food poisoning, maybe it was a stomach virus that came on, some sort of gastroenteritis that made you sick that was completely not related to your food. But if you got sick, really sick after you ate that food, chances are you're not going to be able to bring yourself to consume it for maybe several years, if ever, after you get sick from it. That's a protection mechanism. You can imagine our ancestors back in the day, if they were out foraging and hunter-gathering, if they ate something that made them sick, then this is a way to make sure they don't do it again. It's a way for them to learn. It's a type of learning, very primitive type of learning, that, hey, that thing is bad, don't eat it again. And for the most part, a lot of the animal kingdom kind of works the same way. If you consume something that makes you very, very sick, then you probably should stay away from it again. The one notable exception there being alcohol in humans. Actually, people get very, very sick after drinking maybe a little bit too much. Oftentimes they're right back to it the next night. So there's some other interesting psychological and social things going on there, I think. But in most cases, it is a fairly effective mechanism to avoid those foods that you make you sick. The next one we're going to look at after mimicry and aposematic coloration is what we call a startle display. And so now we're in a situation again where a predator is attacking a prey, but now the prey has some way to somehow surprise or startle its predator to buy itself a fraction of a second and maybe get away from that predator. Right? So we can look at all kinds of moths that have bright colors or eye spots on the hind wings. Normally you don't see them. It's only until you move the front wings forward and all of a sudden there's what appear to be two great big eyes staring back at you. If you're facing that all of a sudden unexpectedly as a predator, that might cause you to kind of take a second and say, look, hold on, just sort of pause for a second and think about what you're doing. And in the meantime, that prey might actually escape. Garter snakes. Everybody's probably seen garter snakes outside. Garter snakes are kind of notorious for doing the startle display where they will actually try to strike at the face of whatever is confronting them. Now, they don't have enormous teeth. They're non-venomous. They're not poisonous. They don't really have much of a way to hurt you at all. But if something is trying to bite you on your face, then chances are you're going to take a second and maybe reflect on what you're doing. And during that time, it might give the snake an opportunity to escape. There's another one called stotting behavior in gazelles. So we'll take a look at that one too. But the idea here is with gazelles, big like African deer sorts of things, when they're confronted by danger, the biggest, strongest, healthiest ones will actually try to hop away from danger. Slowly, sort of casually hop away from danger. Rather than just running flat out and leaving that cheetah or lion in the dust, they'll actually hop or bounce up in the air from spot to spot to spot, which seems ridiculous. It seems like all of a sudden we're taunting the cheetah and giving it a really good chance to capture you. That's not the case at all. But for a long time, people tried to figure out why these gazelles were doing this stotting behavior, and there were some different ideas out there. Number one was altruism, where maybe the gazelle that's doing this weird behavior is sort of sacrificing itself for the good of the group. Probably not a real viable hypothesis, because if that was a genetic behavior, it should be selected out of the gene pool pretty quickly. If you're one that gives yourself up for the benefit of the group, then your genes are not being passed on. So you tend to see fewer altruistic cases in the future. Another possibility is that on these African savannas, the grass is often very tall, and if you're stotting or jumping up in the air, maybe that gives you a chance to see further off in the distance and maybe avoid the next lion or the next cheetah that's waiting to ambush you as you run by it. That maybe is a possibility. But as it turns out, we think this is actually a way for the prey to communicate with the predator. This is a way for the gazelle to say, hey, look, Mr. Lion or Mrs. Lion, I'm really strong, I'm really healthy, I have so much extra energy that I can afford to do this and not even worry about it. Yes, I could just run away, but I'm in such good shape, I'm just going to hop and bounce around and sure, if you attack me, then I'll run, but this is a way for us both to avoid wasting a bunch of energy. And it turns out that probably is the case, because whenever a predator sees a gazelle doing this, they'll actually just stop. It's a bit of a startle display, but what happens when a lion or a cheetah or some other predator sees a gazelle stotting in this way? It just gives up and goes home. And so both parties now, predator and prey, get to save energy. They're not going to burn up a ton of calories running away or trying to catch the other one. And so it's a win-win. Right? They're not going to waste anybody's time or energy in trying to draw out a chase that has kind of an inevitable conclusion anyway. So here are the gazelles stotting, sort of bouncing from spot to spot to spot, and Mr. Cheetah here is sort of waiting and thinking about, what I use the word thinking here loosely. This is not conscious thought, but when they see this happening, there's a genetic predisposition to say, you know what, forget it. I'm just going to go and wait until the next thing runs by before I attack. This is a polyphemus moth, which is relatively common in our part of the world. Great big moth, size of a small bird, but when it pulls its front wings forward, you see these great big, what almost look like the eyes of an owl staring back at you. And so you can imagine if you're a predator that sees this at night, when the lighting is not very good anyway, you might sort of jump back a second and say, whoa, what is that thing? And then in the meantime, the moth has escaped. Or at the very least, if you're a predator, you're probably going to try to attack back here. Most predators will try to attack the head region because that's the easiest way to get a kill. If you attack the wings, what you think are eyes but are actually wings, and even if you make contact, if the moth loses part of a hind wing because it's been chomped off by a predator, the rest of the moth can still escape and live to feed and probably breed another day as well. So that's a way to deceive the predator into attacking the wrong part of the body in that case. Another possibility, if you're an individual at this point, now you've been seen, the predator's attacking you. Now it's down to speed, agility, some sort of weapon, some sort of deceptive coloration, some way to survive the attack once it occurs. If you're in a group, that might be even better, because not only do you have a better defensive mechanism, like these musk oxen up here. This is a group of animals that you do not want to go near, because they have very, very little sense of humor in this case. When they're like this, what's going on here is all the young, old, and sick individuals are surrounded by, like these two guys here. I don't want any part of them. They look like they're just grumpy, and I'm not going anywhere near those two. Behind them, protected by them, are the babies and the sick ones and the older ones. So you get a pretty large, pretty strong group of individuals there to help fend off potential predators. With meerkats, the more pairs of eyes you have looking around you for danger, the more likely you are to spot danger before it kind of sneaks up on you. The downside, of course, to that is competition. So in birds, it's the same thing. The more pairs of eyes you have looking out for danger, the safer everybody is as a group. But then on the other hand, the more competition there is as well. There's a bit of a tipping point beyond which having more individuals is not necessarily good. With zebras, there's a confusion effect. So if you have a herd of zebras running as a group, all these black and white stripes are going to run together, and you're not going to have any individual target that you can attack. You want to, as a predator, you always want to have one target to go after, and just attack that one target. Not go after the entire group, because you can't take out the entire group. You want to have one target to pick out and attack. And so as these zebras kind of all blend together with their stripes, it becomes much harder for the predators to attack that one prey. The other thing here that the like last resort for the prey and being in a big group is that if you're in a big group, then there's always a chance the predator might get full before he gets to you. So this is like your last resort. It's eaten 5 or 10 of your friends and neighbors, and by the time the predator comes up to you, he's like, you know what, I'm done. I'm gonna go sleep this off, and I'll see you again some other day. But there's a satiation effect here as well for predator and prey that we can think about too. So parasitism is also a really interesting topic in itself. If you ever get a chance to take a class on parasitism, fascinating stuff. So there's also potential here for coevolution as well, as host species are parasitized more and more by parasite species. They come up with new ways of avoiding being parasitized. Parasites then come up with new ways of attacking hosts. We can look at external parasites. These would be things like fleas and ticks and those sorts of things. Mites also would be external parasites. We tend to call those ectoparasites because they feed on the outer surface, versus endoparasites, which feed on the inside of the body, which we'll see here in a second. There are also what we call, I mentioned this previously with that mantis, but what are called parasitoids, which are insects that parasitize other insects. So maybe you have a wasp or a fly that lays its eggs in a caterpillar or on a caterpillar, and when those eggs hatch, the larvae then consume that caterpillar. That would be a parasitoid sort of a thing to do. This picture here has a parasitic plant. These yellow strands of what look like spaghetti all over the green plants. These yellow strands are a plant called dodder. And this is dodder, not like a female offspring, but dodder like D-O-D-D-E-R, dodder. And so what they're doing is pulling nutrients out of these leaves and using it for their own biology, because these dodder plants are not especially photosynthetic. They get their carbohydrates by parasitizing other photosynthetic plants. Endoparasites have some really cool ways to help them invade their host and be successful in their host, and maybe even get from one species to another species. A lot of endoparasites have really complicated life cycles where they have to go between an aquatic species and a terrestrial species, or from an animal into a fungus or something like that. They often tend to be very much highly evolved with their hosts, and oftentimes very simple as well. If you look at something like a tapeworm, tapeworms are fairly advanced evolutionarily in terms of like time, but when it comes to their overall structural complexity, they're actually very simple because their host does much of what they need to do for them. They don't have to have a lot of their own structures because the host does things for them. But again, you can see all kinds of very intricate behaviors between parasite and host where you've got, in this case, ants that are infected by a fungus. What they'll do is they'll climb to the top of a blade of grass, they'll clamp onto it with their mandibles, and they'll just sort of sit there and wait. And what'll happen is an herbivore like this deer will come along, feeding on grass. The ant is clamped on top of the blade of grass. The deer actually consumes the ant accidentally. It's there anyway, so it gets consumed by the deer. And once that occurs, as the ant is digested, then that host or the parasite can move on to the next host, which is the deer. So there's some fairly long, sort of convoluted stories about how hosts get infected by parasites or infested by parasites, and how parasites get into their hosts. It's pretty interesting stuff when you take a look at it. All right, so we're going to stop here, and we'll start up the next section with competition.